How does one navigate successfully the Jewish environment and at the same time maintain the connections to the Arab roots, and such that after you graduate, you then can quote unquote go back home? So that's the challenge. That's the challenge.
It's a constant challenge, and it's a constant tension between being part of the general culture and still maintaining your sectorial culture. And that's one of the main issues that I think the state of Israel, as a state of immigrants from the diaspora, is struggling with. And I wonder if you think that the issue is only educational, although education is I think it must be the key issue in this whole thing. But I think it's more than that. It's political. It's economical. There's so many aspects. There's so many. There's so much that is connected to this issue. And while there were all kinds of attempts to create other communities in Israel, we have the kibbutz, which is it was supposed to be a place in which everyone is equal.
Sure.
And apparently democracy is the best among all possibilities, and in democracy you have differences. And I was wondering about your thoughts on that.
Well, I'll share the thoughts out of a U.S. context. We have an interesting contradiction in the democracy as we practice it in the U.S. It is a really wonderful concept of equality among all, and this principle that everyone should have voice and be valued. And then we have this bit of a contradiction and difficulty that comes out of an economic system that is expressly pyramidal and expressly hierarchical, because capitalism does not allow for the principles of democracy. And so those two are at loggerheads with one another in my country. And that's what I'm talking about, is the United States. And so that then becomes the difficulty. A really wonderful vision of the equality of individuals and individuals being valued, but at the same time running headlong into an economic system that can be very ruthless in terms of just emphasizing that if you don't have, then you don't matter. It's the simplest way of putting it. If you don't have resources, then you're not important. And the simplest notion being that it's almost a jungle mentality, and left to its strictest devices how capitalism functions. And ultimately there's just only so much. We talk about excellence, but the real principle is that there's only excellence at 5% in this tip of the pyramid. So you'll have people who are excellent but who don't fit into the 5%, but it's just as if they're not excellent. And you really had, and you were at the University of Richmond, you know there were students there who were every bit as good as the students at the University of Virginia, but their degrees didn't have the value. They did not have the opportunities to be at the University of Virginia, et cetera, et cetera. So that for me becomes the struggle of how do we line up this flowery, flowing, wonderful rhetoric of democracy with, by making some changes in this very challenging system of economic capitalism, which ultimately is about emphasizing my gain over your loss at the expense of your loss. Yes, please.
If I may, I would like to offer Robert.
And for me, that just further affirms the need for diversity, because ultimately you need the presence of those different groups in the conversation so that we are reminded that physical disability has parallels and has differences and matters. And absent the diversity in the population, then those conversations will get lost at times.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then the second point I would make would be to acknowledge and absolutely accept the uniqueness of Israel, even as I think about South Africa. And in South Africa, I know, so I can really, I'm an expert on South Africa. No, not really. But I lived in Zimbabwe for a while and spent time in South Africa.
The end of Zimbabwe.
Right, and I was there during apartheid in South Africa, so I spent some time. So you had the differences in not only two languages, but, oh, gosh, countless languages. You know, and then you had the differences within the European population, Afrikaners and the English, the Boers and the English, and you know, and the Jewish population. So it went on and on. So the point is not to say that it's not a unique situation, but there's some similarities and parallels. And maybe Malaysia with respect to Malays and the Chinese. So for me, what helps is if I can step outside, because I'm so invested in my situation that I need to seek situations that I can step outside and say, oh, there's some similarities here, and I can maybe take some lessons from the Chinese as a powerful minority in Malaysia, and the Malays and their relationships back and forth. Or in South Africa, the situation between black South Africans and a white minority, by the way, that's very powerful over and exerting influence to this day over the majority. So your points are very well taken, and I just would offer those thoughts as a way of continuing our conversation. And one of the things that we will do very often, and we have to challenge ourselves on, I have to challenge myself on this, is that I become so invested in my examination of the situation of African Americans and the disadvantage of African Americans that I don't stop and say, you know something? Native Americans are worse off in some respect. Because, you know, as I'm pushing my agenda, as I'm doing the questions, I don't necessarily follow that. So,
And Latino?
in some ways, yeah. And it depends on your metric, obviously, but certainly generally on some characteristics, absolutely.
University faculties?
Very few, but the majority, but you have more Latino students than you have black students at UCLA, for example. So I guess my point is, you know, the point of all of this, I have a great phrase I use with my students. The moment you get into oppression sweepstakes, we all lose. And oppression, you know, sweepstakes is the game where I'm more oppressed than you are, or you are more oppressed than I am. We lose that, because then it becomes this sort of dividing and conquering. And we simply must instead argue for and push toward a society that is more equitable across the board, and that creates opportunities for all the different groups, and just allows us to be more human than often is the case under a situation where extreme capitalism runs rampant. Because where it runs rampant, it creates this awful circumstance in my country where you can't even be entitled to the basics of human decent survival. A decent health care, decent food, a decent place to live. It becomes a matter of if you can't afford it, then somehow you're not human. And you're not entitled to those things. And that is ultimately not the kind of world any of us want to live in, I don't think.
I was thinking about how diverse we as a group are. It's also an issue to think about.
And you're a very diverse group, or you're not? I just simply go back to the United States model. Your point, comparison between Ethiopians and Arabs in that educational setting strikes some very similar parallels for me as I think about the relative status of black students around the country, where black students are in a situation of a more larger population, say in the South, and where the political struggles between blacks and whites are more pronounced, then the help that is available, say, to black students in Alabama or Georgia might be less than is the help available to Washington black students, because in Washington there's just such a small group and in just such a different political position that they're not that much of a threat to a status quo. And so it's easier to give the help to black students in Washington but not give it to Latinos in Washington who have more of a critical mass and could be more of a threat to a status quo. So I guess it's a political kind of calculation that I think about in the States as well, and the political realities of whether a group, the tension between groups and the potential struggle against a status quo that privileges one group over the other, if you follow what I'm saying. I'm just saying that blacks in California now are less of a threat to the power structure than they would be in Georgia, where power dynamics have shifted. So I don't know, but again, I don't know the situation in Israel. There are others that can speak to it better than me. I mean, the distinction between Ethiopian and Jewish students, so please.
Wolter?
Yes?
I wanted to ask, going back to academia and universities.
But are we leaving this point?
Yeah.
See, this is again conversation. See, when you run away from a point, I'm going to keep pressing us to talk about it. Is there anything here to this issue?
I think that the distinction you made between power and keeping help given to poor groups and preserving the overall power relations in the society as opposed to empowering, threatening large minority groups is very important here. Because giving help to underprivileged small groups is relatively, as he said, easy. It is much more difficult to be threatened by large minority groups that wish for power and wish to transform the society you live in and wish to transform the society you wish to live in, because different groups' ideas of what constitutes the goals for the future are different. So this is a very important issue, and it really, and I think it's true in the United States, but it even is more so true in Israel, that is fighting for its own existence, and threats are very, stakes are high, and threats are high. So this is a very important.
It's a point well taken. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to suppress your point, but I wanted us to stay with this, and that really helps me. Because it also draws a parallel that was raised a moment ago about the status of Latinos in, say, California relative to the status of blacks. Black people are a smaller minority group in California, so a safer group to have stronger representation among the faculty from. So you have more of us among the faculty, even though there are fewer of us as a percentage of the population. Whereas Latinos, who are a larger percentage, and in fact a majority in many parts of California, are systematically underrepresented on the faculty. So, and it ties back to your point.
The black community in suppressed for many years.
Yes, for sure. I'm sorry, your point.
Okay, it's a different issue.
Yes, I understood.
I was thinking before we started talking about it. In universities or as a population, as a state, so try to be multicultural, but the knowledge, you also talked about all kinds of activities that teachers or lecturers in university could do, or the head of universities could do, to form a better psychological environment. But I wonder if you think of the academic knowledge, which is predominantly white and Western values that influence what is taught, should or can be changed to knowledge that also is more suitable, or not suitable, that also comes from minority groups, which is a different knowledge. And I'm not only talking about our history or ways of teaching our history as white people, but even the way of thought that is different in different cultures, and is really a good university, what's considered very good, have a very systematic, unique way of teaching and systems of knowledge that are very that have one way or unidimensionalized. The question is, even if the knowledge could be diversified so as to not to fit, to come from different minorities. And like I just read Min Hatrin, you know, she's a Vietnamese woman. She writes completely differently. She writes differently, and I know she's accepted. I sent an article and he said we must read Min Hatrin, but her way of writing is completely different than the mainstream. And I wonder if, but I didn't see any other examples.
And she's writing
she's writing about ways of remembering and knowledge and tallying in her society.
What is the name again?
Min Hatrin. I can write it down.
Please, because I'd like to take a look. But she is, of course, writing in English, in academic model.
Yeah.
But
yeah,
still, at least pressing that model to her.
But she's different from all other third world feminists that write in very mainstream media. And the question is, if universities should change the way, add different kinds, or if it's possible, how could it be done?
I think it's possible, and I think the way that we can achieve it is just by, it's often very difficult for an individual or just for a homogenous community to make those changes, and thus we have to bring in different voices and give those voices some room to express themselves and be heard. And I think we then will see some of the changes. Just the simple fact of you ignore disability until someone in the room says you're ignoring disability. You know, so that you're not speaking to these issues, and then can speak out of their experiences about the unique qualities as well as the shared qualities. So it becomes conversation, and it becomes representation, and broadening the diversity in the room. And I just think it's possible. Ultimately, we're academics, and we learn new things. I mean, that's how we define ourselves. That we open ourselves to new experiences, and we learn from them. And but all of us should have the rhetoric that says that we are open. I mean, that's part of our identity as an academic. Your identity as an academic, even if it's not the truth, is to say, I'm open. I'm open, and I want to learn. And so the thing is to at least challenge people on that point. Test them on the point. Test ourselves on the point. But it's difficult. I mean, I was just sitting here thinking as we were going back and forth about how hard it is for me to release my privilege. Okay, I'm disadvantaged as a black man, but as a man, I'm privileged. Yes, and you have to and as a heterosexual man, I'm privileged. And some of those privileges I don't even think about. They're just my birthright. They're natural, they're my birthright, and people challenge me and say, of course, I'm heterosexual, and the world is heterosexual, so we should be first in line. Of course I'm a man, and men have certain kinds of preparations, and history has been certain. So, somehow that should give you an advantage. So you really, as we interrogate these issues and struggle with them out there, we have to interrogate and struggle with them inside too. And it's difficult, and it just helps other people to hold us to the fire, and for us to hold one another to the fire. And I honestly, the moment I think that the change is not possible, I'll leave the discipline. I mean, I'll leave this field because I'll have to do something else. So I believe we are capable of that change.
It's like Hillary Clinton as opposed to Barack Obama. Like white man, black man, that was the debate.
But that was the way it was framed, and needless to say, it was, and again, ultimately, that was a false construction. That was a false framing and construction. But at the same time, we had some reality.
Thank you.